All right, so we got Coach Ron McKeefery, the man, the myth, the legend, going to spend a little bit of time with us today. Coach, I'm going to do this a little different than I have in the past. Normally, I kind of like to have dialogue and more of a conversation. But honestly, with you, you have such an interesting perspective, and you're exposed to so many different things. I really just want to fire away a bunch of things that, I think a lot of things that our interns, myself, my assistants, and people that keep up with the show want to know. You just have a lot of insight too. So I'm going to just rattle off things and fire them off at you. And there's a lot of stuff I want to get out of your brain today. So as long as you don't mind, that's what I plan on doing.
No, awesome, man. Let's do it.
All right. So just having a little different perspective now. This is kind of a self-serving, selfish question here, and being, out of the football side of things now for a few years. I guess one, have you continued to shape your training philosophy as if you were still thinking as a football strength and conditioning coach? And if so, just kind of walk us through what your general training philosophy is right now.
Yeah, I mean, I very much still coaching quite a few. I'm even coaching still a couple football teams, but that said, I always look at it from a football strength coach's lens as I go through things. In fact, I try to challenge myself to go through and learn from these, really ask these coaches from like a rugby or from maybe an MMA or something along those lines perspective of what they would do if they were in a football strength coach's shoes, having never been exposed to the sport. That's been really insightful because obviously we come at it from a background of having coaches input, learning from whoever we learned from, the combine. A lot of different things are kind of already preset. So if you knew nothing about the sport, how would you attack it is often a question that I ask whenever I'm traveling or meet somebody from a different sport. And, it's definitely insightful. That said, I feel like, going back to what I learned from Ken Manny 25 years ago, and really being a principle-based strength coach, not a philosophy-based strength coach, really has shaped everything. And I still feel like I come back to that even with as much as I learn.
In what ways, I guess just more detail into that, in which ways would you say, or I guess what would you say is the biggest difference between being a principle-based strength coach versus a philosophical or philosophy-based coach?
Yeah, I came to that early on in my career because I kept getting the question as a young strength coach, what's my philosophy? And as a young strength coach, I had no idea what my philosophy was. Now, Ken Manny had sent 10 principles over that he based his program around. And, I kind of took that and I would answer that question by saying I was principle-based, not philosophy-based. Now, what I've learned is, I grew up, I learned weightlifting from Istvan Javorek, so the Javorek barbell complexes, dumbbell complexes. I grew up down the street from him. So I grew up a weightlifter. So traditional periodization, traditional lifting. And then one of my first jobs was with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which was traditional high intensity training, one set to failure. And what I learned really quickly was both worked. Here I was, and, I saw unbelievable results as an athlete myself and what it did for my teammates, but then turn around and we're in the NFC Championship game using a high intensity program, and so those 10 principles: overload, progression, balance development, periodization, perfect technique, variety, supervision, reversibility, specificity, evaluation. Everything kind of comes back to that. And that's something that even early on, I would print that off, and that would be something I would go into interviews with to make sure that I was on the same page as a coach. Now, I've been in every scenario. I tell a story now. Recently, I was over in China. We work with 29 of the Chinese Olympic teams. And, I've got 5 coaches that I'm onboarding to leave in China. We're setting up the weight room. We had taken the coaches through kind of a workout to show the leadership committee what we were going to be doing. And, we set the weight room up. It's about 9:00 at night. We set it up perfectly. We're ready to go. We have a session at 6 a.m. the next morning. We get there at 5:30, and they had taken every single weight outside of the weight room and shipped it off somewhere. And here we are on day one, and so if my program was, powerlifting based or weightlifting based, then I would have been in in a lot of trouble, especially for about 2 weeks, which it took them to get weights back in.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, the way I describe it now is to have a big toolbox and be able to go to that toolbox whenever you need to be able to pull something out to be able to get the guys to push past their present capacity in some shape or form.
Yeah, no, I love it. We talk a lot here about concepts, conceptual. Like we talk about 40-yard stance starts. How no 240 stance starts are going to look the exact same, but there's certain concepts that we want to see, and that's what I love. That not the principle versus philosophy. That's awesome. All right, let's keep rolling. So, biggest unique thing I think you have is you are surrounded by so much knowledge all the time with what you've done with Iron Game Chalk Talk, which shout out to that show. Awesome tool for our industry. What you do with play, just what you've done in your career, and then everything you've learned just from trial and everything you've done. There's so much information that's around you at all times. What is your process? I mean, I'm just trying to think in my head, like, how do you absorb that information? How do you say, okay, I'm going to apply this thing. Okay, hey, that's a really good idea, but it doesn't fit into my program. How do you have a system, or what do you do to process all that information and then apply it?
Yeah, great question. One of the things that I recommend my interns, my staff do, especially when they're young, is for them to essentially take each topic of strength and conditioning, and this goes to a bigger conversation about niching down and trying to become an expert in a specific area, so that you bring something to a staff's that's unique, that you bring value in. That said, early in my career, I came from an NAI program, no strength coach. In fact, they just hired their first strength coach just a couple of years ago, and I had nobody to kind of really point to or teach me the different principles of strength and conditioning. And so I started from literally a blank slate and had to build my knowledge base across the board. And having a filtering system really was something that, you just couldn't keep up with all the information. So what I did is I would keep 3-inch binders. I don't do this anymore. It's more digital now, but I would keep 3-inch binders on each topic. So speed and power and weightlifting and nutrition and every component of athleticism. And when I felt like I would collect information, I would collect articles, I would collect manuals were big early on in my career, lectures, the whole deal, lecture notes. And when I felt like I had enough information on that topic, I would write my position paper on that topic.
Really?
So, and what I ended up doing was I used a lot of those papers, and I would turn those in as papers from a master's degree. And I would just manipulate the teacher and let me turn in something I wanted to turn in, as opposed to what they assigned.
Right.
But what that did was it gave me a filtering system that every time I read something new, I had something to base that from on whether or not, if it was contrary to what my belief system was, or if it was something that added to it. And essentially I would create PowerPoint presentations for each one of those topics. And that became, became my question is, does this deserve a slide in my PowerPoint presentation? If it doesn't, then it was something I would let go. If it was, then I would add a slide. I did this last night. I was watching Peanut Butter Falcon or whatever with my wife, and there was a quote in the movie that applied to a leadership presentation that I give. And so I just made a slide really quick on my phone and stuck it in that presentation to come back to it for future reference. So I think you do have to create some sort of filtering system, whether or not that's digital or it's a paper of sorts. If I was a young strength coach, I would do what I did and turn those papers in. But as you get older, I think having maybe PowerPoints or presentations on different topics is a way to kind of, make it so that you're not drinking water through a fire hydrant.
So what's the biggest mistake when you talk to younger coaches? I guess let's just say any coach in general, as far as as far as what you just said, as far as you see a coach who reads something all of a sudden wants to change his whole program or whatever it may be, what are some of the bigger mistakes you see in that?
Well, I think you just hit it on the head. I think not having again, I take everything back to principles, and so if I can't explain how I overload it or how I progress it, or how it fits within the periodization scheme of my program, or if there's perfect technique or I can add variety to it, then it doesn't go in. And I think so many times people want to try things. I mean, the reality is that you're the guinea pig. You need to be the guinea pig, not your athletes. And so tried it in your own training, 100% agree with. Trying it on your athletes, I think that's the big mistake that people do. And, especially being older now and seeing how my body feels each and every day, there's no doubt that I did some things that were probably not smart through the years. So I think being too quick to throw things in, I think being too quick to try to appease the shiny object syndrome is what is probably the problem that most coaches do, instead of just sticking to a really solid program that can be built upon it.
What do you think, if you had to assess just I guess your program, what you're doing with your athletes right now, and even maybe throughout your career, what if you had to say a percentage, what percentage or range would you say of your program adapted per year? Like how much would you say, hey, yeah, that really changed this year. I really changed that this year?
Yeah, I'd be lying to you if I said it was a lot. I would say it hasn't been a lot. Now, what I try to do is I really come at things from that variety principle, and really, I try to change implements. I try to change execution or rep speed or something along those lines to make it different. But I think when you throw too many new exercises or too many new strategies at your athletes, the reality is that 4 years is only, especially in a college football setting, is not very much time to create adaptation, especially when you throw in all the stresses that come with it. And so being consistent and being able to build upon that year after year, I think is super important. And so, yeah, I would say if I was putting a percentage on it, I would say maybe 20% of my program changes, but it's only really changing in, tempo or execution or implement or modality, things along those lines.
Ron McKeefery, right now sitting in that chair, he calls Ron McKeefery at USF 22-23. What does he tell him?
Yeah, I mean, people often ask me, because I asked the question in my podcast, what's the biggest mistake, right? To me, the biggest mistake I made, especially as a young Ron McKeefery at South Florida, if you go back there, there's a dent in the door where I threw a 45-pound plate at a kid for being late. To me, confusing passion with emotion is the biggest thing that most coaches fail to realize. You want to show your athletes how passionate you are about them making the right choices, but you let emotion creep in. And when you do that, there's a chance for you to break down the relationship, and so you cut the kid out, you call him a name, you do, whatever, you throw a plate at a kid, there's a chance for you to break down the relationship. Right. And so I think it's important to take a breath, pause. Doesn't mean that you need to hold them any less accountable to whatever that may be. I think you got to over communicate your accountability structure and what constitutes the standard and going against the standard. But once you do, you need to be super consistent. You need to be non-emotional. I'd say that is even as a parent now, having 4 kids and raising 4 kids. Those are relationships you can't break down, right? And so if you have an emotional response there, it's a big problem. So taking a breath, hold them extremely accountable to the standard, but being non-emotional when you're dishing out your accountability.
You bring up the standard, and it's interesting because we've talked about this, but I feel like a lot of coaches, and even I spend so much time programming and down to the rep, right? Down to the percentile, down to the velocity, down to the yardage of the tempo run. And we spend all this time on these details of programming. But then you think about the standard, right, and what you talked about in the culture, and do we spend enough time talking about or programming and really being intentional about culture and about the standard? I ask myself that all the time. I think we need to do more, but I guess my question to you then would be, how much of a role do you think that plays in the actual success of a program versus, we spend all this time talking about programming and we think that helps us win games. Where does that stack up compared to culture and standard?
Yeah, this is a big question that I get a lot because, traveling internationally quite a bit, the rest of the world does a much better job of science driving training than the other way around, right? And you go into some of these countries where it's so research driven that it's almost like a laboratory when you walk into a weight room session, and you feel like if you raise your voice, it's going to be out of line, but then you turn around and you come into some of our settings, and it's freaking nothing but jumping up and down and screaming and music blasting, but there's not a whole lot of real science going on in coaching. I think I think it's extremely important. I mean, I wrote a book a couple of years back where I feel like to be a success, you have to be three things. You have to be a great technician. And that's what you're talking about: sets, reps, volume, intensities, velocities, all super important. You got to know that inside and out to be a good practitioner. But to be the next evolution in that is to be a great manager of time, people, and resources, and people being the most important part of that. And then you combine that with being an entrepreneur and always kind of sharpening the sword and challenging your ideals. Really, if you do all three of those things, that's how I think that you get to the next level as a strength and conditioning coach. When you come back to managing people, there's a good book by Chip and Dan Heath called Switch. Hold on, I'm sorry. Hold on. There's a good book by Chip and Dan Heath called Switch, and in that it gives the visual of a man riding an elephant down a path, and the man represents the rational mind, the elephant represents the emotional side, and the path is the situational world. And so whenever you're trying to change culture, whenever you're trying to change a person's mindset, so many times as coaches, we give them all the science jargon, and we speak to that little man on top of the elephant, and we try to convince them that drinking water is good, right? So you should drink water because of all these reasons why hydration is important, right? But we don't tap into the emotional side. So if that elephant wants to go left and you want to go right as that man, which way are you going?
Left.
You're going left, right? So we got to tap into the emotion, and that's where the culture piece and the energy piece and all that comes into play. Is you got to paint a picture that it's not because it's transactional of you telling them that you're going to win more ball games or whatever. That's coach speak. Everybody says the same damn thing, right? What you got to do is you got to tap into the emotion of why they want to be great. Why do they want to accomplish? What goals do they want to accomplish? And why? And I think everybody has a muse. Everybody has a version of something that they want to be. So for a lot of coaches, that's some other program, right? That's Alabama, that's Georgia, that's the New England Patriots or whoever it is, right? They're always comparing themselves to them. For athletes, a lot of time it's a pro athlete or somebody along those lines. So you got to tap in. There's all kinds of strategies, but finding their muse and using their muse as a guide is definitely one of those ways. Creating emotion in the room and tricking them into working hard. That's kind of a very superficial way of doing it, but it's effective. But really got to get it in and going back to like the Simon Sinek, start with why and really tapping into what they do and why they do it is important, And so for me, I always talk to, our players. I always ask them, three questions. When I first meet them, what would they do if they didn't play football? Right? What's the most difficult thing they've ever been through in their life? And then who's their inspiration, right? Who's the most important person in their life? And when you get into, like, most athletes have never thought about their mortality in the sport. So you really start to tap into what motivates them outside of football or basketball or whatever. Then we're usually a product of our adversities, and we're usually motivated by that. So knowing that, so when you find out what motivates somebody, you can tap into that in the training session. It doesn't become a yelling deal. It doesn't become a transactional deal. It becomes like, dude, you have told me that this is what you want to do with your life. Is that choice really helping you do that? And you just put it back on them. So as simple as that, non-emotional. And I'm telling you, like 9 times out of 10, it's going to clean things up right away.
Yeah, no, I can't agree more. I think it's such a challenge of what you said, just finding a balance. Like it's you feel like everybody's got to be on one side. It's either all the science or it's all culture. And we miss the boat by not just, it's okay to have a little bit of both. I think that's where it lies. But what spinning it to industry wise, if anything, you're on top of our industry as far as seeing the most, hearing the most. You've pushed our industry in a great direction as is, and I thank you for that. But what else needs to change? Where do you see in our industry what else needs to change, and what can we do as coaches at this level to help change it?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the kind words. I think a couple things. One is we're still in the first 100 years of our profession, right? It's only existed really, I think, 68 years, in modern form, right? So we have an obligation as coaches in this time to be able to document things better than we are. Think about if you could go back and you could document medicine or law or, engineering or anything. Think about if you could document the first 100 years better. That's important, right? So we all have an obligation to give back and to find our contribution to this first 100 years. I think the 3 things that will be the most impactful in this time, in our generation of coaching. One, I think you need to put a strength coach at every high school. I think that it serves as a good breeding ground for young coaches without the eye of and the pressures of ESPN and the media and all those types of things. You can make mistakes, but not so bad that you hurt somebody or those types of things. I think it also gives you a place for your aging strength coach to go when they're done chasing the logo, when they just want to stay put in a certain location, and you look at most other countries, their best coaches are with their youth. So putting a strength coach at every high school, I think, is super important. I think creating a degree in strength and conditioning is a necessary must in the next 20 years. What that does is, you give another place for aging strength coaches to go and mentor younger up and coming strength coaches. I think you drive research from practitioners instead of academics. So people that have been in a weight room like myself for 25 years, I've got a few ideas of things that I would like to try if I had time to be able to do research. And I think it's important to bolster our academic. Strength coaches are some of the smartest people on the planet. That's why I named my book CEO Strength Coach. I think if we did anything else, we would be the CEO of companies. Take special people to be able to get people to run through a wall at 6 a.m. and in the freaking 6 degrees, and do it with a smile on their face. Like, most people can't do that. So, and the intelligence that goes along with it. We got people that are PhDs that can't find jobs. So we've got to, I think, building up our academic profile and creating a degree is important. And then third, I think we need to create what's called a high performance manager in other countries, but would be an associate athletic director in our country. That, most of the time that's a strength coach, because they have a relationship, they can speak and they're a liaison with the coaching staff and the head coaches. They're trusted. As opposed to most associate athletic directors in this environment are, they're not experienced. They're usually lawyers, or they're maybe maybe they're a level removed from the interactions with the coaching staff. and so they're not trusted. So the strength coach is being able to move into some of those leadership positions to be able to lead up and down and horizontally. I think is super important. So if we did those three things, we put a strength coach in every high school, we created a degree, and we started becoming associate athletic directors, I think that would do more for our profession than anything for the last 10 years, 20 years.
Yeah, I think the last point kind of hits it, but I mean, you spent a lot of time in Europe, so you've seen how integrated they are with strength and conditioning, AT, physical therapy. I mean, do you feel, and obviously at least how I feel is in America, we are not very integrated. We're not doing a very good job of being a cohesive group that's just here for the athletes. I think there's a lot of ego there. There's a lot of, just newness to it in a certain degree. But do you think that third point you made about having associate athletic director title for strength coach will help with that integration?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, strength coaches and ATs or strength coaches and, nutritionists or whatever. I mean, the only time they really have problems or because they're siloed and they're fighting for turf, right? Fighting for resources and those types of things. If there was an integrated model where there was a collective effort coordinated by somebody to break down those walls and increase communication and really come at it, like you said, from the athlete's perspective and focused on going down the line and saying, okay, what are we doing for Deion Sanders, number 2? What are we doing from academics? What are we doing from nutrition? What are we doing? How do we make this athlete the best they possibly can? Then I think you start, especially if you have somebody that's in that level that has the head coach's ear, there's a lot that can be done, and I think again, why that's often become a strength coach that becomes a high performance manager in other countries is because they are considered part of the coaching staff, and they are, and they do have the trust. And that's the part that, like we keep fighting as a profession, that we keep fighting to go into the medical model. And it's so wrong, in my opinion, to do that because we think that that's going to provide stability for us, and we're not going to get fired and this, that, and the other. But I mean, the reality is that's such an important job that it's always going to be a part of the coaching staff, So now you went to being paid less and probably being the seventh person, the seventh smartest person in the room, when you're comparing yourself to a neurologist and a physical therapist or whatever on paper, I should say on paper.
Yeah.
To being, what we truly value is coaching. I mean, that's a word that should be celebrated. That's leading people on a journey to some destination they can't get to on their own. I mean, that's where the root of the word comes from. So, like, we should embrace that. Instead, we should be fighting to be the third coordinator or the assistant head coach. And if we do those things, now we really do have a seat at the big kids table, and we can affect some change, and in those other countries, that high performance manager is usually a strength coach because of the trust and because of the integration of having so much. And when you're not fighting those turf wars and you have the ability to step back, then you start to look at it from other perspectives, and you start to say, okay, here's how I can really help athletic training and maybe help bolster their point, as opposed to being in the moment, a kid walking in that hadn't showed up for weightlifting, hadn't showed up for treatment on time, and then it appears like they're getting out of something, right? So that's when we don't tend to handle that well.
Well, Coach, I know you're wildly busy, and it means a lot. Obviously, you coming on and spending some time with us. Before I let you go, just we have at least who this is directed towards, or who I try to really open it up to is young coaches in the industry. Any advice or one main piece of advice you have for young strength coaches or young upcomers and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge in this field is hold on one second. It's not getting dogs. That's my advice. I love them. Yeah, I think the biggest challenge for coaches, there's a good book that I'm actually reading right now that really sums this up well, but it's the Infinite Game by Simon Sinek, and it talks about the difference between finite games like playing football, right? You know the rules, you know the players, you know what a win is and what a loss is, right? But then there's the infinite game, which is like you don't win the game of life, you don't win the game of parenting, you don't win the game of even strength and conditioning, right? It's an infinite game.
Yeah.
And so the goal in an infinite game is to stay in the game. And so many times as coaches, we don't plan for those periods of transition, right? And that's tough. You know, whenever whenever you go through challenges in this field where you're going to be at the highs, the peaks, and you're going to be at the lows where you're not making any money as an intern, then you're going to get a couple jobs and then you might get fired. Those periods of transition are the parts when people typically are forced out of the profession, right? And so what I've tried to do in my career is for 25 years, I rode the wave, right? But I've also set myself up by creating other skill sets to be able to use everything that I've learned and continue to kind of create a little bit different route, you know, and stay in the game and on my own terms. I think that's the most important part, right? I'm not things, you know, like a coach isn't dictating things to me anymore, or an AD isn't dictating things to me anymore. But I'm still making an impact in young people's lives. I'm still improving the profession. I'm still coaching, those types of things. And so to me, it's having a plan for the periods of transition. I think that's the best piece of advice that I would give coaches these days, is making sure that you understand that there are going to be ups and downs, and that you're prepared for those moments of transition, and that you're developing other skill sets. You know, when I first got into kind of thinking like an entrepreneur, thinking like a business person, I did it because our head coach got fired at South Florida. I didn't know if I was going to have a job. I mean, I was strength coach of the year. We'd been to 4 bowl games or 5 bowl games at that time straight. We'd been up to a number 2 ranking, and all of a sudden I could be fired, and that didn't sit well with me, you know. Just the lack of control in that. It bothered me. So I read every business book you could, and I was like, I was going to get out. I was going to, you know, that's why I took the military job. I was going to build a business on the side, and when I got big enough, I was going to get out completely. And what I learned by learning all these different business skills was that made me a 10 times better strength coach. You know, when I learned time management skills or outsourcing or learning how to actually read a P&L statement or things along those lines, it made me a better coach. And so I think so many times where you get so wrapped up in reading all the different strength and conditioning books and becoming such a great technician that all of a sudden you look up as a 40-year-old man or a 45-year-old man and you're out of a job and you're like, okay, now what? And so if you develop those skills, then you start to learn how to develop really true beneficial relationships across the entire platform. And being at places like Buffalo and others, there's so many resources available to you that, again, if you're playing the small game, the finite game of just trying to win ball games, and you're going to do it at whatever expense, then you're going to be ups and downs, right? But if you play the infinite game and you're looking for all these strategic partnerships and relationships, you know, who knows where those relationships are going to take you down the road. So that would be probably the piece of advice I'd leave you with.
Yeah, no, I think the question you get as a director all the time from other coaches or people that I've worked for in the past or people that work for right now is, what do I got to do, or what's my next step, or, you know, am I ready to become a head strength coach, or what do I need to work on to become a head strength coach? And my answer is almost always get better at managing people, whether that be athletes, coaches, situations. But I think that's a huge takeaway, especially I think for young coaches trying to get into those roles. Is you talk about, you know, being a great technician. I think we pour a ton of our time into doing that. But how often do you think about your managerial relationships with your players, with administration, with donors, with whatever it may be? But what are your managing skills like as well? So tons of good stuff, Coach. And like I said, I really do appreciate it. I'm well aware of your schedule and everything you're doing, and I keep up with you. So I know spending 30, 35 minutes with us is a chunk of time. So I appreciate you, man. And once again, thank you so much for what you do for our industry. You're one of the big guys that motivated me kind of down the path that I went, as far as really giving back and trying to give as much knowledge as I could to the industry. So I appreciate you, like I said, leading the way for us guys, and keep in touch. And it's always a pleasure.
No, awesome, guys. I appreciate you. And like I said at the beginning, I know how much work goes into putting these types of things on. And, anybody that puts himself out there and tries to better not just himself, but other people, is somebody that I want to be friends with. And watch what you guys have built and what you've done in your careers. It's motivating as well. So appreciate you. Thanks so much, guys. Go get you guys aren't playing Eastern this week, right?
No, that one's over.
All right, well then go get a W this week, and we'll talk to you guys later.
All right, sounds good, Coach. Thank you.
See ya.